Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to The Print. I have with me today Dr. Yun Sun, and she is the Senior Fellow and a China Expert Director at the China Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Welcome to The Print, Yun, and thank you for giving us the opportunity. I'll straight away start my questions without wasting much time. To understand what, in your viewpoint, is happening right now between India and China, if I can put it bluntly, and the question that is there in everybody's mind, are we headed for a war?
Well, that's a great question. To begin with, I think the two sides, as we currently understand, the two militaries are still engaged in some standoff and confrontation, especially around the Pangongzhou Lake area. The two foreign ministers during their meeting in Moscow had agreed to 5-point consensus. And one of those consensus stipulates that the two militaries should engage in dialogues and to negotiate their disengagement in a timely manner. There's no timeline to it. So where we're now is that I think both militaries are stationed, deployed in the disputed area, and neither side is willing to be the first one to withdraw. So some negotiation apparently are happening on the ground, but we haven't seen the concrete result yet. So most likely we're going to head into a situation where both militaries will want to continue their deployment in that area despite the winter weather. So instead of having a war immediately, I think what we are more likely to see is more of a war of attrition. If you think about the concept of attrition, not necessarily in an escalatory military conflict, direct conflict sense, but in the sense of both sides will be there and they will be confronting each other.
Okay, so if I can ask you, as you have pointed out, to a war of attrition. Now, if that happens, how do you see the final outcome, if I can say, that sort of panning out for both the countries? Because no matter how much kind of antagonism we are having at this point of time, both countries do share a very deep bilateral relationship.
And I think for policy analysts like myself, that's what we have been calling both countries to recall and to remind them that this bilateral relationship is more than just a disputed border. There's a long history, and there's also economic and trade relations. There's the political solidarity among the emerging powers. So there are a lot of other components to this bilateral relationship other than the disputed border itself. So we hope that reasoning will prevail, and both leaders and both governments will realize that fighting a war, whether it's a hot war or a cold war of attrition in that area, is not in anyone's interest. So if anyone thinks they are winning, they might be winning the battle and losing the war, losing the bigger strategic picture of the bilateral relations.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you must have heard Defense Minister Rajnath Singh speaking the other day at the Indian Parliament, upper house and the lower house. And you also must have read and deeply studied the 5-point agenda that Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar had with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Now, keeping both these two together, the 5-point agenda and the statements made by the Defense Minister, do you see a kind of consensus both sides are coming to? Do you think that this can finally settle the matter?
The both sides, you mean the foreign ministry and the military, or both sides as China and India?
Both sides, as in India and China, but you've heard the statements coming out from India's both the foreign ministry as well as the defense ministry.
Well, I think for the Chinese, as a China analyst, I don't speak for the Chinese government, but I do analyze their positions. So I think looking at how China views the positions that has come out of the External Affairs Ministry and the Indian military, I think the Chinese see some level of inconsistency there. that the foreign ministry is very much committed to the withdrawal and to the de-escalation of the tension, but the military from India seems to be quite keen on the restoration of the status quo in the pre-April state. So I think that does raise a question as for what is the priority here? That if returning to the status quo ante, the pre-April status quo ante is India's indisputable goal here. What if China does not comply? Then are we going to head for a hot war? We're going to head for a prolonged period of confrontation between the two countries. So I think there is that issue. So I think the two militaries, the Indian military and the Chinese military, they are on the front line. They're already deployed. So they're ready to station their position or to stay in their position until there is a political decision made on the top to say that, okay, we're going to withdraw or we're going to continue to continue this standoff on the disputed border. But the foreign ministries apparently are more committed to negotiations and to disengagement. But then you have to question that on both sides, meaning both on the Indian side and the Chinese side, are there inconsistencies between the positions of the foreign ministry and the militaries?
Again, coming to the 5-point agenda that was set up. Now, there was a very key point, and that was the last point within those 5 points was about having and concluding new confidence-building measures. Now, India and China, they have these 5 broad border agreements, protocols, as they are known as, within which there are several confidence-building measures that are there. What, according to you, can be, the new set of CBMs that can be worked out, or do you think they could be a value addition to the previous ones?
I think the last point in the 5-point consensus is a very encouraging sign. I think it does suggest that both governments are trying to manage the tension and trying to charter a way forward. But I also think that point itself does not address some of the fundamental problems that's embedded in these border disputes. So we know that for the western sector of the disputed border between China and India, due to the inhabitable condition during the winter and all year long, military deployment is improbable. It's very difficult to achieve for both countries, and that does create room for different interpretations and room for imagination when the next spring comes. And both militaries will be redeployed there again, and both sides will try to advance their position or to consolidate the control of what they believe to be their legitimate territories. So I think that issue is not necessarily going to be addressed by new confidence building measures. We also know that in early September, for the first time in 45 years, the firearms was shot in the western sector of the disputed border. So that's something that's already been included in the previous confidence building measures, I believe from 1993 and from 1996. So I would say that although negotiation of new confidence building measures would be highly important, it doesn't really address the sovereignty dispute or the territorial dispute between the two countries. And looking at the current situation, I would say it is even more important to adhere and observe to the confidence building measures that has already been reached and abided by two countries for the past 20-something years.
Right. So if I can then ask you as a follow-up to that answer of yours, do you think that now that both sides have agreed to, discuss maybe a new set of CBMs or strengthening the old ones, the understanding or the clarification of LAC, the line of actual control, is what is seriously required now between both the sides? And as what, you may be hearing a lot of voices in India, former diplomats, the present diplomats, many military generals, they're all talking about the fact that China is probably claiming a position which they had previously held in 1959. It is from there that India should start the negotiations. Do you also agree to that?
Well, there are different signals from China, from Beijing, that we can see that China is probably aiming for their line of actual control back in 1959. So remember what happened during 1959 and 1962 in the Chinese perception was the Indian forward policy that advanced towards Chinese territories that eventually led to the 1962 war. That's a very Chinese-centric, Sino-centric perception, but that's how China has viewed this territorial disputes in a historical perspective. I would say that if India and China are focused on the clarification of the line of actual control, both sides will have to engage in extensive and intensive diplomatic negotiations with historical facts, with legal documents. Basically, both sides will argue their own case that why the line of actual control should be where I think it should be, or where India thinks it should be, or where China thinks it should be. However, I think the problem with that approach is that both sides have historical evidence. And it's very difficult for either side to accept the legality of the evidence from the other side. So what that means is in terms of a political negotiation, both sides will have their own evidence and they will stick to their own positions. And the political negotiation is very unlikely to go anywhere. So that's why in the Western sector, we are at this unfortunate position that we are today, because political negotiations has not really rendered a concrete result, which means that the line of actual control can only be consolidated on the ground by the pulling and hauling, by the positioning of the military troops, so that the two militaries will develop a consensus as for where the other side is firmly stationed, is firmly controlling. So unfortunately, this is evolving towards what we are seeing between India and Pakistan in terms of the line of control in Kashmir. So because the two militaries have been so intensely deployed in that area, there's very little room for imagination or very little room for misunderstanding. So unfortunately, maybe for the Western sector of the disputed border, that is what it takes for a line of actual control to emerge gradually on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Also, if I can ask you, and that's a very important point that you have stated, and I can assure you that within the Indian defense and the diplomatic community, all these discussions are going on. But again, India has always stated that dialogue is the only way forward. The fact that the channels of communication is open with China is a positive sign. However, when you talk about again talking about CBMs and all these things will come when the present situation is kept under control. Now, at what point do you think that sort of a breaking point will come where both these sides would sort of think about pulling back, or the status quo ante is what everybody is talking about? Do you think that will be possible, given the fact that within this 4.5 months of standoff, many things, many negative aspects have come into the bilateral relationship?
I agree. I agree with you. I think the diplomatic channels have been open, and the two sides have both expressed the willingness to negotiate and have dialogues to solve this issue. But I think it also should be noted that neither military has withdrawn. And I think from the military point of view, they're more likely to watch the behaviors of the other side rather than listening to what the diplomats are saying. So there is, with this distrust currently, I think, between China and India, there's a tendency for both countries or for both militaries to feel that, well, the diplomats are negotiating, but we're not going to abandon our ground until we get a clear message, probably from the top leaders, to tell us to. So this dual track approach keeps diplomatic negotiations going, but at the same time also keeps the military troops deployed up there, seems to be a strategy that both India and China have adopted so far. The issue of the status quo ante is a great one. And I think this is a very good question for the Chinese side, that if China was reacting to India's behavior, then why would China not return to the status quo ante? So I think that is a great point. But I think the Chinese reaction would be that, well, if we're going to status quo ante, are we talking about a pre-May situation or pre-April situation? Or we're talking about pre-2019 situation when the Article 370 of the Indian Constitution was not revoked? Or we're talking about the pre-DBO road status quo ante? So what I'm trying to say is that if we go back to who did what first, that's going to be an endless debate as for who started it. So in order to move forward, to focus on who did what at what time, therefore who is responsible for the current tension, is unlikely to lead to the most constructive result.
So let me talk about, and good that you mentioned about engagement between the top leaders. Now, we've seen there have been several rounds of discussions and consultations happening at the commanders level on one side, and also from the diplomats on the other side, including the special representative talks, which is known as the SR talks. But do you think this is now time probably for these two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, to sort of sit together and have a dialogue? Because end of the day, they are the ones who created this informal summit, basically to have this kind of, address this kind of situation where they can discuss things informally and get a matter settled. What is it that you think at this, and since you're a China expert, how do you think China is viewing that in terms of both these leaders talking the matter out?
I think that is a great point. I think between India and China, the hope eventually is not for the diplomats to resolve this issue. In the end, it will require the top leaders to show their resolve, to show their determination, to charter the bilateral relations in a friendly direction instead of a hostile direction. So that will require what I call the intervention from the top leaders to say, okay, this is it. And we need to forward, and let's keep the status quo, and let's both withdraw, and let's both keep the negotiation channels open. I think that is what probably eventually will be what it takes to really end this year's escalation of tension. But unfortunately, there are other factors that are interfering in the top leaders' decision making. So I think in the Chinese analysis, when they look at Prime Minister Modi's position on this issue, Prime Minister Modi is asking the diplomats to negotiate, and at the same time, the military is still deployed in the front line. So I think for the Chinese, they wonder that where Modi himself stands on this issue. And then they also notice that the domestic political changes in India, for example, the increasing number of the COVID-19 cases in India, unfortunately, and also the not very good economic performance of the Indian economy during the second quarter, where we saw a 23.9% decrease of the Indian economy. So all those factors, when translating into Prime Minister's political capital or his political decision, I think for the Chinese, the question is, how do those negative factors affect how Prime Minister Modi acts or not act on this on the current issue of the border dispute? And I think there's a perception in China that Prime Minister Modi is in a difficult position in terms of domestic politics. Therefore, his ability to make concessions or to declare the withdrawal of the Indian troops or to have a face-to-face meeting with Chinese President Xi without getting the Chinese to accept the status quo ante is going to be quite limited. And I think those are fair assessment because these are domestic political realities that we are seeing in India.
So that will bring me, to the larger question of what India is doing within its own foreign policy domain and what China is doing now. We can see India is becoming a very active member of the Indo-Pacific construct. It is soon going to host the quadrilateral security dialogue. So all in all, the view in the world is that India is aligning more to the US. Now, we've seen some of the European countries like Germany, France also coming up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. Do you think all this is sort of a signaling towards China. Is China aware of the fact that it is now being seen as the common enemy of the world? How do you think all this is sort of, weighing in within the larger India-China bilateral relationship?
Well, that is a great point. I think India is in a very positive external environment currently. That look at the past several decades, I would even say that India's external environment is at an unprecedented level of positive environment. And in comparison, we also know that China is faced with all sorts of problems, deteriorating relations with the United States, the global claim or the global criticism on China for its early failure to deal with the COVID-19 crisis earlier this year. And also China's relationship with European countries, with Canada, with Australia, are all suffering from China's domestic political factors, such as its national security law on Hong Kong or its human rights record in terms of Xinjiang and Tibet. So I think all those are true. But manifesting that in this China-India relations, that might lead to a different scenario. So I understand from my conversations with Indian strategists and from India reporters, there's this perception that India is in a good position and China is in a very bad position. So therefore, for China to make compromise is legitimate. It's only reasonable because China is not in a very good position currently. So India has a position of strength. So I hear this perception from my Indian friends quite a lot, but I want to raise maybe there's another possibility that from the Chinese perspective, because they see that they are operating from a relative position of weakness, relative weakness, they will want to see concessions to India as even more unacceptable because they're already in a weak position. And if they're making concessions to India, there will be another perception that, well, China is now weakened. So maybe all countries that have grievances to address with China should be expecting China to make compromises on all these issues. So in international relations, there is a debate as for whether a country is more likely to be tolerant and be accommodating when it is operating from a position of strength, or it is operating from a position of weaknesses. So in the Chinese case, because China's domestic political system and because of the strategic personality of the Chinese current top leader, I would say that when China perceives, and if China perceives itself to be in a relative position of weakness, it is even more unlikely to make the concessions. It's more likely to be assertive or even aggressive because China has things to protect.
Mm-hmm. And my last question to you would be, Won, I believe next month the meeting of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee is going to take place. Do you think there will be a discussion on that? And since, again, you being the China expert, you would know, not many of us get to hear the news from inside. Do you think there will be a discussion on how it will steer its foreign policy as far as its neighbors are concerned? And now the discussion that is going on also in the world is diversion of this global supply chains and value chains, which is what also India is looking at. All these things will be coming up in that agenda, the meeting?
That is a great question. There's a little bit of a time lapse, I would say, that yes, the Central Committee's meeting, the annual meeting will take place in next month. But the bigger factor is that the US presidential election is not going to take place until early November. And the result of the presidential election is probably not going to come out until now people don't know how long that will take. So I would say that for the Chinese top leaders and for the Chinese Communist Party, with all these domestic obstacles, domestic economic slowdown, the impact of the COVID, and also the external challenges that China has encountered in terms of the decoupling with the United States, Chinese leaders' current priority is how to stimulate domestic growth again, and how to battle, if that is a proper word, how to battle this US campaign to move supply chain out of China. So I think for China, if you look at this, the new term called dual circulation, the domestic circulation and the external circulation of the economic system, economic activities. And if you look at how the Chinese are trying to stimulate the development of high-tech industry, because now there's a US decoupling specifically focused on that industry. I would say the Chinese leaders' top priority remains to be domestic. But foreign relations is a very important aspect to it, because make it the most simple analogy. If US is going to decouple from the Chinese high-tech industry, the Chinese industries will have to rely on other countries like Japan or European countries or South Korea to fill that vacuum, right? So in this sense, I think foreign policy does play a very important role in China's calculations. So getting back to the question of how China will or will not adjust its foreign policy, I think the Chinese government is very inclined to wait till the US presidential election result is out to make their calculations in the next stage. Because in China, there's this perception that China is having this many problems with its neighbors because of the US stimulation of these neighbors to act against China. So I always preach to the Chinese that, well, you need to have some self-criticism. US might have responsibility to carry, but China is certainly not innocent in this negative interaction with many of its neighbors. So, but I think for the Chinese policymakers, they are more likely to want to wait to see who is the next American president to determine where is the main direction of the US-China relations. And for example, whether the next US administration will still pursue the same kind of Indo-Pacific strategy and pursue a close alignment with India. So those are all the macro level factors I think the Chinese leaders will consider when they look at the relations with China's neighbors.
Yun, thank you so much for talking to ThePrint. Please take care.
Thank you. Stay safe and take care.